really important topic to get beyond the hype around, which is the term corporate social responsibility. What does that mean in the age of the global pandemic, in the age of Black Lives Matter, in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd, which really heightened all of our awareness of systemic racism and systemic injustices in our society? And what does it mean when corporations say that they want to be part of the solution? That's what corporate social responsibility is all about. And we have a great guest to have that conversation today, the Senior VP of Corporate Social Responsibility for Warner Media, Dennis Williams.
Hey, Alfred, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. So listen, let's jump right into it. First of all, what is the path that you took professionally to become the person who you are for Warner Media? What is the education, the skill set? What did you do to make you, one, want to do this, one, for your profession, but two, what is the thing that you bring to the table that made you attractive for this particular position and role at Warner Media?
Wow, that's a big question to answer. I have to say that I think it's because my mother prayed for me. I don't know how else I would have ended up here. Listen, it wasn't a direct path, and I think part of that is that the function of corporate social responsibility has been an evolving one, and one that has changed over time. And so, I graduated from high school in the 90s, and then went off to college. And at the time, certainly no one was saying, when you grow up, you'd like to work in corporate social responsibility. That wasn't even a term that we talked about or that we used. You couldn't major in corporate social responsibility, and obviously a lot of that has changed over time. So, I think it kind of gets to the nuts and bolts of what CSR really is, and that is it has its roots in corporate philanthropy, and this question of corporations, institutions having access to resources, vast resources in most cases, and whether or not they're able to redirect those resources for some kind of larger common social good, right? There was a time when that looked like a wealthy family like the Rockefellers building a church or a public library. It translated into, the local, hangout spot donating jerseys for the local little league team, right? Like it crosses the gamut and has a wide sort of spectrum of, an entity saying that we can exist both for purpose and for profit. So, I started out as an English major, and I just, I think did what most of us should try to do. And that is I majored in what I was passionate about, and that was English literature. Fell in love with African-American literature, and then later decided I was going to pursue, academic education around the stories of African Americans, the things that excited me the most. So, for me, it was like, if I could just sit around all day and read Zora Neale Hurston or James Baldwin, then that's a great life. And then stand in front of a classroom and talk about it. But as I started to explore options, I stumbled upon an opportunity in the late 90s to go to New York and study a conversation that was really, present in the minds of a lot of people. And that was this question around welfare reform. And, no surprise, and I'm going to, talk about the people who were visionaries in this space. But at the time, there was an African-American executive at Time Warner. His name's Dick Parsons. And Dick is a legend in the corporate America. He later became the CEO of Time Warner for a while. But, I think more about sort of where we come from. But, Dick is an African-American man from New York. And so when the country was grappling with the question around welfare reform, this very, very powerful Black executive said, what role can this company play? And we should get someone in here to start to interrogate that, do some research, and come up with some solutions. So my first foray down this path really began with that question that Mr. Parsons was asking. They hired me as an intern to come out and explore ways that Time Warner could use its resources and allocations to help bring people who were on welfare into the corporate workspace and entry-level jobs. That is what was, no one was calling it corporate social responsibility, but that's exactly what Dick was doing, right? How do we leverage our resources for a greater social good? And then, from there, as I said, the power of prayer and relationships and connections, and just sort of wanting to stay in this lane, knowing that I didn't want to be the person, even at a media company, who was responsible for something I didn't care about and I wasn't passionate about. I started working in human resources, specifically doing things around recruiting folks from historically marginalized backgrounds, moved into marketing, again, target marketing towards African Americans, gay, lesbians, Latinos, all the things that were passionate for me, personal passions, were able to translate into my work. And then finally, in 2010, I had the great honor of being asked to create the corporate social responsibility team at HBO. So I'd been at HBO for a number of years, had a conversation about how we were and were not using our resources and our brand to have a larger social impact. And they said, you should create this team. So I did that for about 10 years and now find myself here at our lovely parent company, WarnerMedia, with a larger remit, but still having a fantastic time at it.
So let me say, for the sake of our audience, we know Dick Parsons well. Several covers of Black Enterprise, and he certainly personally influenced me, just as I'm sure he's influenced you.
And so many more. I have conversations with people all over the world.
Yeah.
I mentioned Dick Parsons, and everyone has a story about how Dick has impacted everyone of color. Most people of color in this space can talk about the inspiration or the direct impact that Dick had on their lives. That's what we should all aspire to.
Basic conversation. He'll drop some gems, and he's just being Dick Parsons, and you're walking away with real gems that you can apply to your life and your career. But what I love about your story is that your evolution as a professional kind of paralleled the evolution of corporate social responsibility as a corporate practice. They say you're not new to this, you're true to this, because that kind of you were on the path as that was developing, and you helped to develop that as you built teams to do this. So again, so glad you're able to be here for this discussion, because you're like the right person to have this discussion.
No, thank you.
Talk to me about what corporate social responsibility means at a media and entertainment company, because again, different types of corporations have different kinds of resources, have different kinds of relationships with different types of communities. So CSR is not like a one-size-fits-all, practice in corporate America, because corporations are very different, and they have different cultures, and they have different relationships with customers, vendors, suppliers, workers. It's just a different DNA for every company. What does it look like for WarnerMedia?
Oh wow, you hit the nail on the head, right? I mean, it's not one size fit all. It has to be customized. It has to be really specific to the actual resources and the impact that you can have with those resources. Obviously, for us as a media company, that begins with the images that we show on our screens. Understanding, and I think particularly, people of color, LGBT folks, women, et cetera, this will be resonant. Many of us grew up watching media representations that did not reflect who we were or our experiences. And the psychic impact, the emotional impact that had on so many generations, right, in terms of, what we thought we could be, didn't exist in reality for us until we saw it imagined on our television screens, right? Until someone wrote that Black nurse, until someone wrote that Black doctor, until someone wrote that Black executive, we may not have seen those things in our environments. Or if we did, those things weren't celebrated by the larger culture. And so I've been, really privileged having come out of a place like HBO, where even before I arrived there in the late 90s, there were already people promoting positive images and representations of people of color, right? That's the first thing. Like, if we were this platform and we couldn't point back to, stories like introducing Dorothy Dandridge, right? Or stories like, what we have now with Issa Rae and her brilliant talent, then we wouldn't be living to our fullest potential if we didn't use the platform itself to have that conversation with our audiences. So I think it begins there with the stories that we tell and the storytellers that we are in business and relationship with. I think it also matters what happens in your house. You can't go outside and preach a message and teach a message that you don't live in your own house. And if you do, then that's inauthentic and hypocritical. And so, the way that you can understand if a company is taking their relationship with the community seriously is to see if that community exists inside the organization, and are they listening to that community? Are those people, do they have a seat at the table in conversations that get made around how the business will move and navigate, especially vis-a-vis that company's relationship with a particular community? And so, again, I'll go back to, moving into HBO and seeing Black executives, someone like a Henry McGee who ran all of our home video. And I was like, wow, this is a Black man who's responsible for ridiculous amounts of revenue. And when Henry speaks in a room, people listen to him. And Olivia Smasham, who was the head of our affiliate distribution. I'm like, wow, Olivia is a powerful voice. She has a seat at the table. And so if those executives have a seat, then it means that the business is not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. So I think there's that. But then, most importantly, organizations just have to be true to being willing to make their resources available to the community. And I think that's the big shift that we've seen in the last year or so. The organization saying, are we doing enough, right? If the baseline is who we are and the stories that we tell and our executives, et cetera, is there more that we could be doing? Are we having conversations? I think this is one of the most brilliant things happening in our organization right now. We were acquired by AT&T, and I'm learning, like a lot of the other media executives, the largesse of AT&T and the power that they have. But if AT&T is having a conversation with the legislator around an issue that's important to AT&T's business, and they can also combine that include in that conversation, combine in their priorities, a question around the safety and security of their employees in a particular community as it relates to their policing practices. Right. So if we can say, if our company is going to have audience with lawmakers and people who make public policy, then we're going to bring the issues that are important to African Americans in our company into that conversation. So now this isn't just, it's Dennis's job to do social responsibility or Dennis's team's job. It's the company does this as a course of business, as a matter of business practice. And I think that's really the place where most institutions should be trying to get to and need to get to in the wake of all that we saw last summer.
So you kind of touched on this already. You presaged my next question, but I kind of want you to do a deeper dive. And I'm going to give it in two parts. One, what was the impact on your culture as a company? Well, not just among Black employees, but the whole culture. When we saw everybody looks at the flashpoint as the killing of George Floyd, so we could start there. But in other words, you were doing corporate social responsibility before. It's not like you woke up and said, oh my God, we need to do something. You were doing something. Mm-hmm. But you said it still created, something was different after that.
Something was very different. Yeah. I mean, I don't know the best analogy just yet, except for me, in all the years that I've been doing this work, it's the first time that we've had a sustained conversation about what systemic means. And I think not only in our space, but across a number of conversations, people were looking at the systemic impact of racism. And up until that point, we were all certainly trying to do the best we could. But, if you're treating the surface wound, but you haven't figured out that, the cancer is deeper than what you see on the surface, right? Like, you got to get to the root of the problem and of the sickness. And for this country, I think the conversation shifted, right? Systemically, African Americans and people of color have been excluded from these kinds of opportunities in housing because of laws that were written specifically to exclude us, right? And here's the impact of that. So, you can have a program that says, hey, we want to make sure that we give access to mortgages to people of color. But if we don't talk about rooting out the systemic inequity that exists in the housing system, housing structure, then we don't ever really get to a solve of the problem. If we don't talk about, who gets to tell the story in our industry systemically, who's allowed to be in the room, where are we sourcing talent from, which schools do we think are important, when we see them on a resume, right? Because, oh, well, this school is great because, my nephew goes to school there. Well, if your nephew didn't go to a historically Black college and you're a white executive, then you may not see those colleges as important as the small liberal arts college that your nephew went to, right? So like where those ideas come from really matter. And if we don't interrogate them, and I think that's what we've been able to do over the last year or so now, is to take a step back and say, are our practices rooted in systemic racism and bias? And it's been incredibly heartening for me to have those conversations, because now we're not talking about, now it's not polite conversation. Now the conversation can get real. And if the conversation can get real and we can acknowledge that, we've done our best, but our best wasn't good enough, and there's a better to our best, then we can strive for the better, right? Meaning, we've taken at Warner Media in particular, we've taken a close, hard look at the composition of our employee population. The example I just gave a second ago is like, we have lots of very talented executives that have come to us from historically Black colleges and universities. Are we prioritizing that? Like you would do that with any investment. If, if the stock made money, you keep betting on the stock. And yet what we're saying is people have to prove themselves over and over and over again, because we haven't prioritized historical Black colleges and universities as the kinds of academic institutions that we want to make sure we're tapped into, then we're not making progress, right? So I think that for me has been the most kind of fascinating and impactful shift.
One of the other terms that we heard last year, it feels like it's faded a little bit, but it was a big, big term as we were going through this process in 2020, was this term performative justice, performative activities. How much were corporations doing because it looked the right way, it said the right things, but, and people question, but does this really translate into any systemic change? That has now evolved as you've seen major corporations announce, we're earmarking $100 million for this and $100 billion for that. And there's a new announcement every day. And the question now is being asked, okay, how do we measure the impact of that? In other words, it's one thing to do a press announcement, get a lot of media, of course, Black Enterprise reports and all of this stuff, get a lot of applause for this is really a good thing. And then when does that when and how does that translate to impact on the ground, whether that's supporting Black businesses, supporting HBCUs? I mean, every corporation has its chosen needle they're trying to move. How, in your role, do you determine, one, what needles to move, and how do you tell? What are your key KPIs that says 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, we did more than just make a great pledge in 2021. We actually did something on the ground that mattered to the communities that we were promising to impact.
Yeah, I'm fortunate in that my role actually reports up into our head of inclusion. And so my work is very much connected to those kinds of metrics. And Christy Habecker is our head of inclusion, and she came into our company just ahead of the events of last summer. So she was pre-COVID, she was pre-George Floyd's murder. But even before then, she was already talking about making sure that we had a baseline of comparison so we could talk about progress. You can chart progress. It has often been said in our environment by her, by our CEO, everyone, anything that's important in an organization is measured. So we measure everything that's important to us. We measure subscribers. We measure the amount of time someone is engaged on our platform. We measure. If we aren't applying that same rigor to our conversations around inclusion, if we don't know that we've moved from X to X plus, then we aren't really putting forth a way for people to hold us accountable. So, an organization, certainly in partnership with so many different parts of the organization, it's not just the responsibility of your HR team. It's not just the responsibility of, your employee resource group, but everyone has to be driving toward this understanding that We are here as it relates to diversity. We haven't, we've acknowledged publicly that there's not enough diversity in our company and in our shop. And so how are we going to find ways to get there? I think that's what takes it out of performative and places into a space of accountability. I think too, that the measure should be sustainability, right? Are these efforts continuous? Are you, if you want to, if you want to talk about sustainability, look at what foundations are able to do. They're able to put large sums of money in one place and draw down on interest so that that fund or that foundation continues virtually in perpetuity. And so, if companies really want to be thinking about impact, it's like everything else in the business. We're not planning for our business to survive for 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. If your CEO comes out and says, I have a 1 year plan of success for the business, you fire that CEO immediately. What we should be talking about is, what does this look like 1 year from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, the same way we're charting every other aspect of our business. So I think, it's measurement, it's accountability, but it's also an eye and a focus towards sustainability, right? Making sure that these efforts are sustainable, supported in ways that they can be sustained.
You make an important point that's been made by at least two other top executives that are interviewed for this show, one in the banking industry and the other in tech. And that is, you're not talking systemic change if you're not talking about sustainable change.
Absolutely.
Systemic change stays with the company as it evolves, because companies evolve just like people evolve. Mm-hmm. So one person said that you're working in your role, and speaking to you, but you're working with colleagues and other team members to how do you integrate this into the DNA of the company so it becomes just a natural aspect of the culture, because that creates sustainability. The other thing I want to ask you about that was raised in at least one of the conversations I've had is the degree to which a company like WarnerMedia, a company like AT&T for that matter, is a influencer of other corporations. In other words, the standard of what's acceptable in corporate America, that is one driven by obviously the profitability, the success of the company, because everybody wants to model success, but also to that degree that success is tied to, look, WarnerMedia successfully moved the needle on corporate social responsibility. What are they doing that we could be modeling? And therefore we're talking about, which is very important for Black people, Black communities, and Black professionals, to feel like there are more than, there's not just this one outlier company that's doing the right thing that may or may not be a place I want to work or I can work, but the rest of corporate America is garbage. There has to be some degree, a larger change if you want real systemic change over time.
Absolutely. Peer pressure is not just a thing that happens on playgrounds. I mean, there's corporate peer pressure too. You don't want to be, you want to be differentiated from your competition, but you also don't want to be outpaced by them in these conversations either. And I think you definitely see a lot of that. I mean, there are numerous examples of, the impact that companies can have in social conversations, but it has to start with someone. And that someone is usually the person that gets recorded as the risk taker, the person that was bold enough to do it, the leader in that conversation. And we all want to be leaders, right? No one wants to be the second or third or fourth person that comes along. I'm reminded, one of the more powerful examples of a company, and I know this can be controversial for some. Remember, not everything a company does is good. Not everything a company does is bad, right? They're entities as well. But, I remember personally thinking about the role that a company like Walmart played in Arkansas around legislation that they felt was anti-LGBT. For me, it was personal as a Black gay man thinking like, would my company support me in all facets of my identity? And so when I saw what they were doing as it related to standing up to government officials, et cetera, saying like, hey, listen, if this is on your desk, governor, and you sign it, you need to know that you will be going against the largest employer in your state, right? That's the power of a corporate resource, to intervene in those conversations on behalf of the groups that won't have a seat at the table, same seat at the table that a corporation will have. When I saw that, it emboldened me internally to be able to say to us, hey, we should have no hesitation signing on to an amicus brief for the Supreme Court around marriage equality. We should have no hesitation sending, signing our name to a document going to the governor around, equal rights for marginalized folks in New York State. Because look, if Walmart can take the risk and survive it, that's easy for us. I mean, given who our audience
talk about
is.
the evolution of a company. I mean, what we thought about what Walmart was to us as Black people 20 years ago is 180 degrees from.
Absolutely. And then if Walmart can do it, then it gives space for the Dick's Sporting Goods to do it. It gives space for the Targets. It like their entire sector starts to move with purpose, right, around their initiatives. And so then you become the outlier if you're not keeping pace with the big dog. You become the one that's out of step. And so, the media industry is incredibly competitive, as you know, and we're all fighting to make sure that content creators see our platforms as the places that are most aligned with their vision and mission, for their work. So, we all want to make sure that Ava DuVernay knows that she's going to feel supported when she brings her projects here in a very particular kind of way. Want to make sure that, Michael B. Jordan stays in our family of talent. We want to make sure that the Easter egg. So if we don't create the most optimal space for that talent, then they can look across the street and see that it's somewhere else, then, we're gonna lose out. So it is very competitive to stay on par or beyond, where your competition is in this social impact space.
Now, all that said, I want our audience to know this is not easy work. I think you kind of foreshadowed a little earlier. To some degree, there's always, first of all, I tell people the irony of the companies that are really trying to move the needle in this space and making progress is that if you're a company that has no diversity, there's kind of nobody to complain that there's no diversity. But if you're actually trying and something goes wrong, then there's people that's willing to, oh, this is messed up what you guys are doing, and then you got to kind of deal with the negative fallout. So there's even a risk in trying to do the right thing versus the company that's taking no risk because they have no diversity and there's nobody really looking at them, at least not in that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know what I'm talking about.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I mean, there is certainly the never enough crowd, right? So no matter what you do as a company, and you just kind of have to accept that, I mean, I know I keep going back. I grew up in Kansas. I'm a product of my family. They're in my brain all the time. So I keep going back to the things that my mother and my grandmother said, you're going off to school. Not everyone is going to like you. That's fine. You accept that. So then you don't have to come home every day saying, I didn't get invited to this or this person. Like, not everybody's going to like you. So not everyone's going to be happy in the moment that you want to be happy. So companies have to have the ability to have a thick skin, as my mother would tell us to have, and accept the criticism that comes in for trying. You'll get criticized for trying because you expose what you haven't done, and that's fine. That's the first step. The next thing is
if you're trying, there's a risk of failure. The only way to avoid failure is to not to be trying.
Is to not try. Right. Is to not try at all. The other thing too is that companies are made up of lots and lots of individuals. And you and I both know, one of the things that we work hard to combat is this idea that Black folks are monolithic, and that we all think the exact same way. And so, if you put 10 of us in a room and you say, which organizations should the company be investing in the nonprofit space, I can guarantee you we're going to have 11 different opinions with 10 of us in the room, right? You're going to say we should be doing historically Black colleges and universities. I'm going to say we should be helping, make pathways for marginalized women of color. This person over here is going to say we should be focused more on the trans women that are dying in our communities. So we're not all going to come at it in the same way. If I'm the corporate social responsibility officer and I say this year we're going to focus on historically Black colleges and universities, I know that there's going to be some applause in the room for that. There's going to be some eye rolling in the room for that. And there are going to be some people who say, but I didn't go to historically Black college or university. What does it have to do with me? So I'm not looking for 100% consensus. I don't think that that's going to be possible. What I am looking for, though, is to make sure that we're doing the most we can with what we have. And so if we aren't doing anything, that's a problem. And so that for me is the goal, is to, like, every time we're asked to give an accounting for how we're utilizing those resources, can I point to something that has improved the lives of the communities that we say we're here to represent? And that's that's an ever evolving and dynamic conversation for us to be having.
So in the time we have left, I really want to focus on the near future, in terms of your role, in terms of what Warner Media has dedicated itself to accomplishing. What is it that you're striving to get done, let's say between now and this time in 2022? What are the focuses and the impacts that you're trying to make in that kind of year forecast window? Again, we are still wrestling with, let me say this, none of the things we're wrestling with in terms of the systemic issues of our society are going to get resolved in 5 years. So
No, no.
what we're trying to do is move the ball down the field in a way that's responsible, that's effective, and that leaves it in position for someone else to move it down the road. So one of the things I tell people, no corporation or even corporate America in general is not going to fix this by like
No.
2025, no matter what kind of programs you put together.
I love that you said that. Love that you said it, because I think the other thing is corporate America can't fix it on its own, right? We need government, we need nonprofits, we need communities, we need community organizations. Like, it's a coalition of people that will fix the problem that impacts us all, not any one single entity.
Because we're all part of the same system.
Absolutely.
It's not like there's somebody operating outside the system. We're all within the same system. We're all evolving. But that said, what is it that you want to see? What is it you're trying to accomplish as an individual leader and as a company over, say, the next year? What do we should be looking for from WarnerMedia?
Warner Media is a collection of some of the most powerful brands in the world, and brands that have been in the lives of people for as long as they can remember. Whether we're talking about a Warner Brothers or an HBO or a Cartoon Network, or you name it, Bleacher Report. I mean, like, our portfolio is incredibly impressive. And so for me, the goal is to harness the power of those brands to create a singular reputation that Warner Media is the place that cares about the community. And so if we can move all of our programs and orchestrate a crescendo in the minds of our consumers that says, here are all the ways that each one of those very powerful brands that you know and love is showing love back to you and giving love back, then it creates, a very, very strong and compelling proof point that we mean what we say. And so my goal is to make sure, you mentioned this earlier, I get excited when I see other aspects of the company coming to me and saying, let me tell you about this new thing that we have and how we want to connect it to social impact. And I go, it's working. That's what it looks like in the DNA. Not me proactively going out to them, but them saying, this is just a part of how we want to do business. And so I want that muscle to continue to be developed in our company. In terms of like what we're, specifically setting out to do this year, it's scary to me. I'm the father of a 6-year-old son, who's very, very fortunate that he attends a really remarkable public school in New York. There's some amazing public schools in New York. I got to give a plug for those of us that come from public schools.
I back you up. I have raised 3 kids in New York public school system. I'm with you.
Yeah, all the way there, right? Let's not forget that. And so, and I'm super intentional about my kid going to a public school too, right? Regardless of what resources I have to send him to other places. But what that keeps me cognizant of is that COVID has ravaged the educational process for so many kids. And what we know for sure, Alfred, is that will disproportionately impact Black and brown children. And so if we aren't, as a society, being really intentional and proactive around how we're going to mitigate the damage that COVID-19 and the digital divide and all of the issues that we knew existed before COVID, like, they have all gotten together and they've attacked our children, right? They've attacked the learning process of the foundation of what's going to make them successful in life. So personally, that, it's what I wake up thinking about in my own house, is how to mitigate that for my kid. And so it makes sense that in our work, we're focused on education this year, and along with our partners at AT&T, who have allocated a significant amount of their resources to things like distance learning, making sure that regardless of where you are, whether you're sitting in a classroom with your teacher, because we don't know what the future is going to hold for us in terms of that, or if you are sitting at home, that you are connected to the power that will educate you, right? And in a way that's meaningful. So, look for us to continue to do a lot more in this kind of connected learning space, particularly as it relates to utilizing our content, our IP, our resources to speak to what's happening in the lives of so many kids around the country.
You make a great point, because that need for connection is actually quite literal. I know AT&T is doing a lot of work in this space, because you're talking about people that can't even get access to the internet, either because they don't have the device, or they don't have access or can afford the internet, or they literally don't have service where they live. And that's one of the biggest issues we've been wrestling with over the past year. And I know AT&T has been in the thick of that.
Yeah, absolutely. But here's the other thing too, right? Because I said this, like what we learned over the last year or so is that what we were doing wasn't enough. So think about this, and I spent a lot of time thinking about it, right? Obviously, for so long we talked about the digital divide and the lack of access that certain communities had to technology. And then COVID-19 hit and schools closed down. And through the benevolence of some very large tech companies, we saw every single kid, public school kid in New York, get the equipment that they needed to have class at home, right? We saw that in 2020. But we've been having a conversation about the absence of that technology in the lives of kids for decades, right? Since the internet, right?
Yes.
So it means that we all along had the power to change that. We just needed to think outside of our existing constructs, right? What should happen now is that we should continue to think along those lines, not, how much is it going to cost us if we give every public school kid a laptop, a device that they can learn on at home, but how much is it going to cost us if we don't?
How much have it already cost us?
How much has it already cost us? Yeah, absolutely. And so, we solved that, and we solved an issue that we've been grappling with for years in a matter of months, because necessity made it so. And I think if we attack every other challenge with that same focus, that same kind of like, what we need is a solution, an immediate one. And so, yes, it's going to mean it will have a financial impact. We're going to have to fundraise, but we have an immediate need. Let's fix it. As opposed to, let's write a white paper on it. Let's study it. Let's go back and debate it. And then years and years and years pass and Black kids still don't have laptops.
I'm a friend with Damon John, and he talks to me a lot about successful entrepreneurs. What I think is important for individuals, for companies, if we can operate to some degree that like we're in crisis when we're not in crisis. Like we can say, oh man, suppose all of this disappeared, what would we do? And you had a plan for that, as opposed to waiting for the crisis to hit and being forced to. Then things, it's easier said than done, obviously.
Oh yeah,
yeah. Entrepreneurs act like, oh my God, it's a crisis.
I don't know. Maybe it's just human nature, but it's like I need to make sure I have visitors coming every week so I can clean up really fast on Fridays. Otherwise this place would be a mess. But the necessity, the urgency of it makes it possible. And I totally agree. We have to act as if every single challenge in front of us must be solved immediately, not eventually.
Right. So final thoughts, Dennis, in terms of I always like to have almost a hopeful future thought from my guests. And I want you to think this even in terms of the world you want your son to grow up in.
Mm-hmm.
What do you hope is the legacy of your corporate social responsibility work is in the life of your son and others of his generation?
Now you're going to get me crying here, Alfred. Don't talk legacy and my kid.
My Oprah moment, man. Oprah moment.
It's difficult for me to describe to my 6-year-old what I do for a living, right? Because I'm not a doctor, I'm not a lawyer, like those kinds of concepts that he's really familiar with. And so I try to keep it really simple for him. It's sort of the same thing I say to my team. I grew up loving superheroes. And I still do, whether it was the X-Men or Spider-Man. I mean, that was my Saturday morning
Don't get me
routine.
started, Dennis. Don't get me started.
I'm a superhero kind of geek. And what I've often said is that the mark of a hero is someone who uses their powers for good. We all have power. Whether it's a little bit of power or a lot of bit of power, you have power over something or someone in your life. The question is whether or not you use that for good. That's what defines a hero. And I hope that what my kid sees and what my kid eventually grows up and takes into, whether it's corporate America or whatever other space he creates for himself, making the next iPhone or whatever that thing is. I hope that what he takes with him is that he has a responsibility to do good in his work. And that if people move into companies, I talk to our interns, speaking of young people, I talk to our interns every summer, and I always tell them the same thing, which is you may not end up working at Warner Media, but know this. If you go and you interview for a place and they don't have someone in the company who does what I do, you're going to go work for a bad place. If you're going to work for people who aren't thinking about this, who aren't intentional about this, that's not a good environment to be in. People in that environment have to be thinking every single day, how do we use our powers and our resources for good and for the largest impact that we possibly can have? And so I'm hopeful and optimistic that more companies are doing that more employees are walking in the door saying, hey, I heard that great benefits package. I love that I'm going to get an office with the window, but can you tell me about your corporate social responsibility? Can you tell me opportunities that you create for your employees to volunteer in their communities? Can you tell me how much money the company is giving to the nonprofit organizations that I care most about? If people are asking those questions in the interview process, then companies have to respond.
I can't think of a better note to end our conversation on, Dennis. Listen, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Wisdom, just sharing your experiences has been very, very powerful. And it really accomplished my goal to really put some real thought behind what these words, corporate social responsibility, really means in the lives of people beyond. It's just a quote unquote corporate term of the day. So
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having this conversation. I hope it's impactful for everyone who's listening, and I hope it adds more to the change that we want to see. So thanks.
I have no doubt that it will. So this is Alfred Edmond Jr. again with the latest edition of Beyond the Hype. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.